Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Today, our guest is Pulitzer Prize winner Joby Warrick. He's a reporter with the Washington Post, and he has written a very fascinating book called Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS, probably one of the most comprehensive investigations into how this terrorist organization rose to the amount of power we know today. So, well, Joby Warrick, hello and welcome to France 24. Thank you very much for being with us. My first question is, your book is fascinating. It's written like a novel, and it is full of very interesting data. How did you manage to collect all this information?
You know, a lot of the book just grew out of my personal reporting. I've been covering national security and the Middle East for a number of years. I travel frequently to the region. I have really good contacts and sources in the countries where the things are taking place. So sort of the challenge for me was to try to make sense out of a very complicated situation, to explain to people the rise of ISIS and the history of this movement, which really goes back a very long ways, but also to do it in a way that was brought characters to life and showed to people the sort of the drama and the narrative really of the rise of ISIS, not just the facts.
Abu Musab alZarqawi is, according to your book, the instigator, the mastermind, finally, behind ISIS, but in fact, he actually died before the group rose to power. And also, the story starts in Jordan, according to you. Can you tell us a bit about that so we understand why you believe Zarqawi is, in reality, the instigator of the Islamic State group?
Yeah. Yeah, Zarqawi is really the indispensable character in the story of ISIS. You can take out any number of other figures that come, including Baghdadi, I believe. But Zarqawi was the one who really came up with this idea of restarting the caliphate as a short-term ambition, something that he wanted to do in the here and now. Brought in the sort of the kind of brutality and sometimes violence for its own sake, the beheadings and the other just acts of sheer terror that Zarqawi did that were really unique to him and his brand, that were different from what al-Qaeda did. And so you see in him the creation of a new strain of jihadism that's much more radical, much more brutal, and today's ISIS pays homage to Zarqawi, and they're very much in his image.
Now, you also demonstrate in this book that a lot of the mistakes that were committed by the Bush administration finally led to the rise of ISIS. Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely true, because you see in the invasion in 2003, the original sin, this one act that unleashed all these forces that we now see in the region. The Bush administration wanted to make the case that Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda were related to each other. They were working together. There wasn't much evidence, but there was a circumstantial bit of evidence in this person of Zarqawi, someone who at the time was living in the mountains between Iraq and Iran, who had terrorist ambitions, who had had a past connection with al-Qaeda, but wasn't part of the organization. Interestingly, al-Qaeda rejected him as being too brutal and too hard-headed for them. But because of that invasion, because of the destruction of this infrastructure of Iraqi society and governance, you have an opportunity for this very brutal group to take hold. And around Zarqawi, you see this organization of former Baathists, former military officers, uniting with him in common cause to try to bring chaos and to really ignite a civil war in Iraq that would undermine and delegitimize the U.S. role of Iraq.
So, as you were saying, you've been covering national security issues for a very long time. Do you believe when the Bush administration took the decision first to invade Iraq, then to de-Baathify the whole country, and then eventually to hold elections, did they realize that by holding elections in a country that was predominantly Shiite, they would de facto hand power in Iraq to the Shiite and penultimately, in part, to Iran?
Yeah, well, they certainly were warned that that was going to happen. The diplomats, including American officials who were in the country, understood the dynamic between the Sunni and Shia and the Kurds as well, warned that the country was not ready for this kind of democratic process, warned that there were different rival groups that were in position to take over or to sort of bring their own issues to the fore instead of working to unify the country. And yet the Bush administration in 2004, 2005 saw themselves in a terrible predicament. They were looking to try to get out of the country, and the way to do that was to rush these elections forward, to make them happen, and then just to hopefully be able to walk away, to turn this over to the Iraqis to manage their own affairs and go home and declare victory.
In doing this, obviously, there was great resentment with Iraqi Sunni population. I actually measured that myself when I traveled there back in 2011, when the American troops were leaving Iraq. It does appear that what ISIS also managed to do, the Islamic State group, was to take contact with all the Sunni sheikhs in Anbar, Samarra, Diyala, and basically turn them over to them. Do you believe that there was actual fighting, or do you believe that basically Sunni fighters within the Iraqi army just turned to ISIS when they walked into their towns?
It's been interesting to follow the arc of the Sunni tribes and their allegiances. In the beginning, many of them were against the U.S. occupation. They supported the insurgency. After a while, they got tired of alZarqawi and exhausted with the terrorist movement, and so they ended up finding common cause with the Americans. And we saw this thing called the Anbar Awakening that shifted the tide, really, against al-Qaeda in Iraq and led to its downfall. But by 2010, 2011, the Americans are pulling out. Maliki government is becoming more assertive, more oppressive against the Sunnis. And so, yes, I talked to these sheikhs as well, and they were quite upset with Maliki and willing again to side with the jihadists to let ISIS in the back door, just as a way of pushing back against Maliki. So there's no question when ISIS begins its march against Iraq in 2014, the Sunni tribes were mostly on their side. They thought they could control ISIS. They thought they could use them to push out Maliki and maybe have their own autonomous government within Iraq. And they just felt that after it was all over, they'd be in charge and not ISIS. And they turned out to be quite wrong about that.
Today, the Iraqi army is fighting ISIS, as we know, in Mosul. They've retaken most of the cities that were under Islamic State group control over the past few months. Do you believe that retaking control of the whole of the Iraqi territory for the government means the end of the Islamic State group in Iraq?
Well, we certainly have a whole new phase of the battle that's shaping up in Iraq, because taking over or reclaiming the parts of Iraq that are under ISIS's control is just part one. The harder part is, of course, the fight in Syria, and that's still to be waged. We're seeing the beginnings of an attack on the suburbs and the environs of Raqqa. But no one is sure who's going to control Raqqa after ISIS is kicked out. So it's really, we're nowhere near the end of this conflict. And even recapturing Mosul leaves many questions open about governance and how these sectarian groups are going to ever get along again in this region that's been so divided by war.
What do you think the Iraqi government is going to do about the Sunnis in the country? Do you believe there'll be some sort of federalism, that they will give them a measure of autonomy in order to quench the resentment of the Sunni population? Or do you think it's going to be back to what it was before?
Yeah, that's the most important question right now, I think. An enlightened group of leaders might be able to come up with some kind of autonomy to allow Sunnis more self-control, to give them more access to oil in the country and other resources. But how that will take shape and whether the Shiite majority will be willing to compromise and to allow those kinds of freedoms, I don't think we really know that yet. And so it's really going to take some very careful and very sophisticated diplomacy and then some to bring these various factions, which are quite opposed to one another, at least in theory, to some form of unity. And so I don't think we really have any clue how this is going to work in the long term or whether it will work at all.
Another question. Donald Trump has just taken power in the United States as president. Do you have any idea of what his plan is? I mean, he's been saying during his campaign that he had a plan, but he couldn't talk about it. Do you have any idea what that might be?
Yeah, that's been the big mystery here in the United States, because we often saw Donald Trump, the candidate, brag about his secret plan that nobody could talk about and how he could defeat ISIS very quickly, even though that eluded, the smartest military minds in the country. We see him moving very quickly now to try to do something. His new Secretary of Defense is in meetings at the Pentagon today with new marching orders from the White House to come up with a plan in the next 30 days that's going to accelerate the defeat of ISIS. What that plan will look like and whether it actually means new U.S. troops on the ground or some other strategy, we don't really know. So it remains to be seen what Donald Trump was really talking about.
Now, we know Donald Trump wanted to impose a ban on Muslims entering the United States. I mean, do you think this kind of rhetoric could also fuel resentment within the Sunni population and eventually, boost ISIS?
And that's a very good question. And we see the concern that's beginning to arise in many of our key allies in the region. These are countries that are on the front line in this fight. They've been helping us try to destroy the caliphate. But to have this rhetoric out of the U.S. White House saying that, suggesting that Muslims are a problem or that they should be banned from coming into the United States, that's certainly a divisive message and one that will hurt the coalition, I think, ultimately, unless the Trump folks can find some way of moderating their tone or showing that they're not really talking about all Muslims, but this small minority. But really, the Trump administration is struggling to find that message right now. They really haven't found it yet.
Well, Joby Warrick, thank you very much for speaking to us. And, well, to you viewers, thank you for listening. And you can carry on watching the news on France24.com.